Kenya Airways has defaulted on an $841.6 million loan. Let me repeat that again. $841.6 million loan from the American Exim Bank for purchase of aircraft. Now, the plan was to buy more aircraft to increase capacity and then increase revenue and profits. But that plan is now a bust. The loss-making national carrier secured the loan with a security from the Kenyan government but failed to repay. Of the $841.6 million, the government guaranteed $525 million of that. Kenya's National Treasury has said that Kenya Airways defaulted on both the guaranteed portion of the loan as well as the non-guaranteed portion. Kenya Airways is 48.9% owned by the government and a group of 10 local banks, which own 38.1% of the shares. Other shareholders include KLM Royal Dutch Airline with 7.8%, employees with 2.4%, and other shareholders with 2.8%. Joining me from Lilongwe, Malawi is Sheon Mendez. He is an aviation consultant. Sheon, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So when we look at this loan from the American Exim Bank, which was meant to purchase 7 aircraft and 1 engine, it looks like a good plan. You have good routes, you have good customers, expand your capacity, make more money, but obviously things have not played out like that. So what has gone wrong for KQ?
Well, to look at what went wrong with the entire, KQ story, you need to probably go back around 10 to 15 years. And, in the early 2010s, under the former CEO, Titus Naikuni, Kenya Airways came up with a very ambitious expansion plan, which they called Project Mawingu. And this basically involved acquiring a bunch of aircraft, expanding to, I think it was 25 destinations over the course of 10 years, growing their fleet and, getting a footprint in North America, Australia, and just beyond Africa as well. Unfortunately for them, they launched this plan in 2012. That was probably the worst possible time for Kenya. There were security issues which began to crop up around that time, linked to Kenya's proximity and involvement in the conflict in Somalia. That led in turn to a significant drop in tourism and of traffic that was coming to Nairobi and through Nairobi. And basically, it left Kenya Airways in a situation where they'd acquired too much debt to acquire those new capital assets. And that debt could no longer be supported by the cash flow from the slowdown, and the much less than anticipated growth that they were able to achieve with these new assets. So it was an unfortunate situation. Kenya Airways was doing extremely well up until that point. But when you look at, when they launched this ambitious project, that was where things basically started to go south for them and has basically put them into the situation they are right now, where they're at risk of defaulting yet again on another loan.
So yet again on another loan. So obviously this is a situation which Kenya Airways has found itself before now. But beyond that, a lot of this in most of the conversations, many people think it's linked to COVID-19. But I'm very happy you've been able to establish that there were issues with the airline prior to COVID-19 coming about. So let's look at what the government is doing now. So the government through the National Treasury says it's in the process of novating the debts, which means that the government has come in as a third party to take up the rights and obligations of the airline from the original agreement. Governments had guaranteed $525 million out of the $841.6 million. So right now, what is Kenya's government on the hook for? The total amount or still just that security that they guaranteed in this loan? What does it look like when it comes to the shillings in conversation on this?
Well, it's a tricky position for the Kenyan government. As you know, there's just a new government that has come into power over there. So a lot of this is inherited issues that they're going to have to come up with a plan to deal with. But you have to look at a situation which is that government has 3 roles here. The government is, of course, the government of Kenya. It is the guarantor of part of these loans. And it is also the single largest shareholder in Kenya Airways. So while the government is legally on the hook only for the guaranteed portion of the loans, if they want to keep the airline flying, in which of course they are the shareholder, they will need to ensure that these debts are paid and that the airline does not get sent into liquidation. Additionally, being the government, there are political ramifications. If you allow Kenya Airways to be shut down, there will be a significant drop in economic activity overall. There will be jobs lost. Is this something that a government is ready, willing, and able to do? So it's a difficult situation for the new government to be in, and they're going to have to make some of these decisions in the near future as to how much of this loan they're willing to shoulder themselves, and potentially other creative solutions to this. And if you look back at the history of Kenya Airways, this, as I said, this is not the first time that KQ is defaulting on debt. In the past, when KQ defaulted on debt, they converted that debt to equity. And a number of Kenyan banks wound up holding around 30% of the airline because loans that they had made to Kenya Airways were instead converted into equity in the airline, and the existing shareholders were diluted. So that may be an option again if the government is ready to take on some of the loan, which they are not obligated to. They could do that in terms of a sort of a nationalization where they convert that debt into equity as well. So the options are there. The question is, where does this new government want to go with these various options? And I think that is the $800 million question.
And I like the fact, because I was going to ask about these options, and given the fact that William Ruto just became president, and he has said he's going to deal with Kenya's debts, and we've seen Kenya's debts being one of those that's been flagged because it could put the country into distress. When you look at them taking on a $525 million debt, it becomes a very tricky conversation to have. But beyond that, we know that KQ has been surviving on state bailouts before. There was the bailout of 9.8 billion Kenyan shillings in September. That was just a month or so ago. Then there was 11.48 billion last year as well. So this situation is one that many would say they've been able to predict. But let's talk about the restructuring. Because of the state of Kenya Airways, the government has been pushing for restructuring, and under the plan, the airline is required to reduce its network, operate a smaller fleet, possibly reduce its workforce further as well. And there are conditions for it in order for the government to help. Has Kenya Airways been able to make any progress with restructuring?
Well, you know what? Kenya Airways problems, as I mentioned, are over a decade old. They have lost money every year for the last 10 years. So effectively, they've been surviving on government bailouts, either in cash bailouts or in restructurings or similar for a decade or more. The problems are far deeper than just COVID. In fact, COVID might be the crisis that they needed to give the impetus to all the various stakeholders to restructure. The new administration is something that KQ management is very optimistic about. I had a long chat with some people there last week, and they think that this might be, the ultimatums that the government has given them, that this is the time you need to restructure and there will not be political interference and so forth, could be something that they need. Over the last few years, KQ has already renegotiated, I'd say, if not all, at least the vast majority of their aircraft leases, the ones they've been unable to renegotiate with the lessors. They've cut loose to reduce their fleet as needed. Their operating costs have been restructured from top to bottom. They've relooked at their procurement. They've relooked at their product. They've relooked at pretty much everything they spend money on and said, do we need this and how can we make it more efficient? The revenue flows have been restructured. They've looked in terms of key partnerships rather than having to do everything else themselves. They've expanded their membership in the SkyTeam program by being more active there. They've got a new strategic partnership with South African Airways, which gives them better access to the Southern African market than they could do on their own. But I think what is really the biggest issue they have is labor. Labor issues have always been a problem in Kenya Airways, and I think that links back to the political nature of being a partly government-owned airline at the time. And they're currently in the middle of a major dispute with their pilots. The pilots are threatening to strike, and there seems to be a bit of an impasse there, where both sides are unwilling to back down on their positions. Where Kenya Airways maintains that they simply cannot afford to maintain the current levels of the pilots' provident fund, while the pilots are unwilling to even negotiate the possible reduction or elimination of that benefit to them. So, there have been a lot of steps taken, but it's effectively a situation where you are rebuilding an aircraft that's already in the air. And, it's not impossible to do, but it's very, very difficult to do. And a lot of people who've tried to do this kind of thing in the past have failed. KQ's got a very good management team there, led by Alan Kilabuka. He's shown over the last few years that he's got the ability to be both a plain speaker as well as be a diplomat. So, I think they've got the best possible team to potentially help weather this crisis. But, sometimes that may not be enough. And they're going to need a buy-in from all the various stakeholders, their vendors, their creditors, their government, their labor unions, and so forth, if this is going to be a success.
All right, Sean, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. It's going to be a success if they get the buy-in from everyone and if everyone is on the same page. Many people are pulling for Kenya Airways. Unfortunately, they dropped in the rankings recently, I think, to 81st position on the list of world's best airlines. But there's potential there. There's history there, and there's also the potential to get back to greater things. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.